Borg is the ultimate user. They're not interested in political conquest, wealth, or power as you know it.
When people think of the Borg, they commonly think of the entity that was met during The Next Generation and expanded on in Star Trek Voyager. A monolithic entity that is probably about as close to fascism as you can get. However, throughout all the series that the Borg have appeared, save for maybe Enterprise, they have splintered with various branches. The Collective, while having the bulk of their drones under one command, are far from achieving unity. Let's just get into it. The first quote-unquote splinter was seen in TNG's Descent. In this episode, the Borg were identified but not acting consistent with the original Borg that had been seen before. This was due to the Collective being disconnected from the main hive and having to sort things out on their own. They would be found by Lore, not this one, but that one, who would trick them into following him. These Borg, while not a part of the Collective, naturally found themselves wanting to have a unified voice. However, the drones did not act like their counterparts. They utilized ranged weapons and cared about downed comrades. Regardless of what it looks like, there also was not unity within this new Collective. A resistance group headed by Hugh formed and went underground to fight the oppressive regime. At this point, they'd team up with the crew of the USS Enterprise D and ultimately be able to defeat Lore. The Enterprise would leave Hugh and the drones to their own devices. Because Starfleet is stupid. We don't know exactly what happened to Hugh's Collective, but he likely created an organization where Borg were able to decide their own fate, and given that we see Hugh helping the Romulans in the future, that Collective probably failed.
We are the new cooperative. We have destroyed the Borg cube. We regret that we forced Commander Chakotay to assist us, but it was necessary for our survival.
The next group to speak of would be to that of the Cooperative, a collective that, to my mind, is as insidious as the main OG and may show us where the Collective ultimately came from. The Cooperative was formed out of fear and self-preservation. They were about to be harmed by members of their own culture and utilized Borg tech to assert authority, to bring unity to chaos, which sounds very familiar. We don't know much about this splinter faction, but given their methods to protect themselves, I'd wager they'd be willing to assimilate entire species for their own protection.
Hear our voices. We welcome you into our vaults. Feel the connection.
But that's just my theory.
You could begin to undermine the Borg's control over you.
It sounds like you're suggesting a civil war.
I'd prefer to call it a resistance movement.
That's very ambitious, Captain.
Another splinter faction that actually gives me hope would be the active resistance within the Collective itself. Thanks to some tech, specific Borg would be able to retain their individuality in the dream state while regenerating. They reached out to the USS Voyager for assistance, which is never a good idea, and their initial plan was to free every Borg. Unfortunately, they'd only be able to free those within the dream state itself. Well, most of them, some died off. And after a brief battle, those who survived would be freed. After this, General Korak would marshal all of the available freed Borg and continue a resistance effort against the Collective itself. Whatever happened to the resistance is unknown, but we are aware that they attempted to contact Species 8472. Their efforts may have been somewhat successful, but ultimately futile, as we know the Collective continued to exist well past their founding.
Hugh?
Until now.
Another subsect that came into being was that of the XBs. XB probably being short for X-Borg. These were individuals whom were being freed on a derelict Borg ship by the Romulan Free State. Yeah, the Federation let the Romulans pillage Borg tech. It's a fantastic idea all around. These Borg were freed and then asked, possibly required, to work on the vessel itself. They were often mistreated and considered resources rather than people, because again, it was the Romulans who were overseeing it. This project would be sabotaged when Seven of Nine created her own collective and utilized them to attack a planet of androids bent on the destruction of the universe. Speaking of that, Seven would become a Borg queen, taking command of the vessel the Romulans were quote-unquote attempting to save, and utilize the Borg on it, likely against their will. She did take the ship and attack the planet of Copolis. I'm probably saying that wrong, but I'll be honest, I didn't want to go back into the episode to see how to say it correctly. The attack would go somewhat poorly, with the cube crash landing and presumably any of the remaining Borg killed. Though they also were killed when they were led into space, which makes no sense because first contact is a thing, but anyway. The 7 of 9 Borg didn't last very long, and they were basically just formed to be sacrificial. Speaking of factions that make little sense, the Jurati Borg were formed when Dr. Agnes Jurati effectively merged with the Queen to create her own collective. The Doctor, who had a lot of potential in the first 2 episodes of Picard and then was effectively character assassinated, would form another, we'll call it cooperative, and take these Borg into parts unknown. While the Jurati Borg would become powerful, from what can be seen, they never directly challenged the Borg, nor would they assist the Federation. They also weren't challenged by the Federation Time Police, cause I guess who the hell cares about that, right? The Jurati Borg would return and gain the trust of the Federation, becoming a provisional member so that they could defend a gate of unknown origin. Being such good members of the Federation, they would stay here even though Starfleet was in its most dire need and had the largest threat it had ever seen, with the majority of the members of it being assimilated, which brings us to the ultimate faction.
They're unlike any threat your Federation has ever faced. They're not interested in political conquest, wealth, or power as you know it.
The Borg Collective is what was discussed at the top. The progenitor of all of the other factions, the Collective was an arguably communistic, or maybe fascistic, we'll go with government. It was bent on the bettering of all peoples at the expense of their individuality and worth, unless you're a certain species that they don't assimilate because they aren't, I guess, technologically savvy enough. It gets weird in Voyager. The Borg would still evolve, but their overall hierarchy and the way they operated was largely the same, with the goal of the complete and utter domination of most of the universe. They would be thwarted and possibly destroyed by the United Federation of Planets, though this happened dozens of times depending on which either series or movie you're watching. The Borg, interestingly enough, are more of a diverse group than one gives them credit for, though that diversity comes in those trying to escape their clutches than their ability to allow others to prosper. Throughout the centuries, they would change and mold with more and more splinter factions existing. An interesting topic to look into, to say the least, but at least that's my thoughts. What are yours? Let me know in the comments below. Don't forget to rate, comment, subscribe, and I'll see you on the next Lore Reloaded.